and is strictly determined by election. Now the covenant bestows this grace, particularly justification by faith alone, as Paul teaches in Galatians 3. Therefore it follows that the covenant and its grace are governed by election in the doctrine of Calvin. That Calvin would put the grace of the covenant outside the government of election is unthinkable, is absurd. The fact is that when Calvin contends for the truth that the grace of God is governed by election, he invariably appeals to Romans 9. And Romans 9 is referring to God's grace in the covenant. Grace to Esau, grace to Jacob, and not to Esau. How closely covenant and election are related in Calvin's mind comes out in his definition of predestination in the Institutes. I emphasize, this is his definition of predestination. I quote, "In actual fact, the covenant of life is not preached equally among men. And among those to whom it is preached, it does not gain the same acceptance." End of quote. And what follows? What follows is that the explanation is election and reprobation. In actual fact, the covenant of life isn't preached equally to all. And where it is preached, the covenant of life, some receive it and some reject it. The covenant of life, in his definition of predestination, is governed by predestination. In the context of Calvin's considering the shameful degeneracy of the Jews in the Old Testament, Calvin assures his readers that, quote, "God's freely given covenant whereby God had adopted his elect would stand fast," end quote, Institutes 264. Calvin insists that the promise of the covenant is for the elect only, so that God establishes the new covenant with the elect. In his commentary on the promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, Calvin says, I quote, "This is that covenant which God promises that he will not make with any but his own children and his elect people, concerning whom he has recorded his promise that he will write his law in their hearts. Now a man must be utterly beside himself." I'm not saying this, Calvin is saying this. "Now a man must be utterly beside himself to assert that this promise is made to all men generally and indiscriminately." End of quote. That's from his Calvinism, page 100. The preaching of the gospel in the sphere of the covenant is governed by election with regard to its saving purpose and power. Commenting on Isaiah 54, verse 13, quote, "All thy children shall be taught of the Lord," end of quote, Calvin declares, I quote Calvin, "The gospel is preached indiscriminately to the elect and the reprobate, but the elect alone come to Christ because they have been taught by God," end of quote. Calvin adds, quote, "Therefore to them, the elect, the prophet undoubtedly refers," end of quote, which means that for Calvin, Zion's children in the Old Testament, mentioned in Isaiah 54, verse 13, are the elect, not all the physical offspring of Abraham. That's from his Isaiah commentary. As this last citation shows, Calvin explains the seed of Abraham and the house of Israel and the children of believers as the elect among the physical descendants of Abraham. It is nothing less than a principle or basic truth of Calvin's interpretation of the Old Testament that Galatians 3 and Romans 9 determine who the true children of Abraham and the legitimate house of Israel are, to whom God is gracious, to whom the covenant promise is directed, and with whom God establishes his covenant. With reference to the fact that many of the natural descendants of Abraham were unbelievers and perished, which might seem to indicate that God's covenant promise to Abraham had failed, Calvin writes, I quote, "The apostle by no means makes the fleshly seed the legitimate children of Abraham, but counts the children of the promise alone for the seed." End of quote. Having restricted the legitimate children of Abraham to the children of the promise, as the apostle does in Romans 9, Calvin is not content to identify these children of the promise simply as those who believe. But with appeal to the apostle in Romans 9, Calvin goes on and identifies these legitimate children of Abraham. Who are they? Who are they in the Old Testament and who are they today? Quote, "The apostle ascends higher, that is higher than the faith of the children, into the mind of God, and declares that those were the children of the promise, whom God chose before they were born." End of quote. Calvin's Calvinism, page 56. Therefore, for Calvin, the covenant is sure and steadfast. It depends upon the promising God, and not at all upon the working children. It is founded upon Christ and his cross, not upon conditions performed by little children or even by grown-up men and women. And its source is the gracious will of God in eternity, not the will of man. That's good news to everyone who believes. Commenting on Lamentations 2, verse 1, the prophets lament over the destruction of Jerusalem and the seeming failure of the covenant of God because of the unfaithfulness of Judah. Calvin proclaims, quote, "Though men were 100 times perfidious, yet God never changes, but remains unchangeable in his faithfulness. And we know his covenant was not made to depend upon the merits of men." End of quote. And merits here stands for the works of men. Calvin expressly declares that the covenant of grace with Abraham and Christ, which is the subject of Galatians 3, is unconditional. I quote from his Galatians commentary. God gave it to Abraham, the covenant of grace, not by requiring some sort of compensation on his part, but by free covenant promise. For if you view it